It is nearly midnight in Pakistan, and two black helicopters are crossing a border that, officially, they have no permission to cross. Inside, 24 men check their equipment in the dark. They do not speak much. There is nothing left to say. The mission has been rehearsed on a full-scale replica of the compound built somewhere in the American desert. Rehearsed until every doorway, every staircase, every sightline was as familiar as a childhood home. They know where the barbed wire runs along the top of the perimeter wall. They know how tall the wall is. They know which balcony has been screened off from the outside world with a partition too high for any observer on the ground to see over. A partition built for a man who stood 6 feet 4 inches tall. They have studied satellite photographs of the compound for months, photographs that showed the same figures moving in the same courtyard with the same unhurried, deliberate pace. Day after day, never leaving, never receiving guests, never doing anything that looked like ordinary life. Across the world, in a room beneath the White House, a president and his cabinet are watching a live feed. It is the afternoon of the 1st of May, 2011, in Washington. It is nearly midnight in Abbottabad, Pakistan. Someone in that room will later say that it was the longest 40 minutes of their life. The helicopters descend. One of them crashes during landing, a mechanical failure, a tail rotor clipping the compound's interior wall. The men inside emerge uninjured, unhurried. They were trained for this. What followed in the next 40 minutes was the end of something that had been building for more than 30 years. The end of a man who had reorganized the fears of an entire civilization. The end, though nobody knew it yet, of something that could not truly be ended simply by killing one person. Because the thing that made Osama bin Laden dangerous had never been contained in any single body. It had always lived in the spaces between nations, in the grievances that go unanswered for decades, in the intoxicating certainty of men who believe that God has personally authorized their violence. He was found on the 3rd floor, in the doorway of his bedroom. He had 500 euros sewn into his clothing. He had 2 mobile phones. He had been preparing to run. He had been preparing to run for most of his adult life. This is the story of Osama bin Laden. He was born on the 10th of March, 1957, most likely in Riyadh, the capital of Saudi Arabia, though records from that era are imprecise enough that some accounts still place his birth in Jeddah, the port city on the Red Sea. The imprecision is, in a small way, fitting. The question of where Osama bin Laden truly came from geographically, spiritually, psychologically, would trouble historians and intelligence analysts for the rest of the century. His father was Mohammed bin Awad bin Laden, a man whose life story is, in its own way, as improbable as his son's. Mohammed was born in Yemen in 1908, the child of a family poor enough that emigrating north into the disputed territories along the red coast of Western Arabia represented genuine opportunity. He arrived, essentially, with nothing. Over the following decades, through construction work, through connections, through an acute understanding of which men in which rooms held real power, he built himself into one of the most significant private businessmen on the Arabian Peninsula. The timing was extraordinary. Mohammed bin Laden built his construction empire precisely as Saudi Arabia was discovering it sat atop the largest oil reserves on earth. The kingdom needed roads, airports, palaces, government buildings. It needed someone who could be trusted, who was already trusted, to build them. Mohammed was that person. The company he founded, the Saudi bin Laden Group, acquired the contracts to manage the perpetual maintenance and restoration of the mosques in Mecca and Medina, the two holiest cities in Islam. In 1964, the company was granted the contract to reclad the exterior of the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. The bin Laden family was not merely wealthy. It was woven into the sacred fabric of the Muslim world at its most material, most architectural level. Osama was the product of a particular corner of this empire. His mother, Hamida Al-Attaz, was a Syrian woman, 14 years old, when she became Mohammed's 10th wife in 1956. The marriage produced one child, Osama, and then dissolved almost immediately. Whether it was ever a formal marriage at all has been disputed by historians. Some accounts suggest Hamida was more accurately Mohammed's concubine, a term that illuminates something about the texture of wealth and power in that world and that era. What is clear is that Mohammed bin Laden had, across multiple marriages, dozens of children, and that Osama occupied a particular, somewhat precarious position in that vast family. The only child of a mother who was briefly and tenuously connected to the patriarch, then gone. Hamida remarried within a few years to a business associate of Mohammed's named Mohammed Al-Attaz. They settled in Jeddah and had 4 children together. Osama was sent to live with them. He was raised, then, in a step-family, in his mother's household, in a city of salt air and money and conservative religious tradition. As the half-sibling of dozens of brothers and sisters he barely knew. His father, despite the separation, was not entirely absent. Mohammed bin Laden, by all accounts, placed enormous importance on the religious education of his children. He was a devout man in the manner common to successful men of his generation in Saudi Arabia. Piety and commerce fused together, each lending legitimacy to the other. Mohammed bin Laden died in 1967 when Osama was 10 years old. A small plane he was traveling in misjudged its landing approach and crashed. He was 59. The Saudi bin Laden Group continued, managed by older sons from earlier marriages, and it would go on to become a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate. Osama would eventually inherit a share of his father's estate valued at somewhere in the range of $30 million, though that figure, adjusted for inflation and the trajectory of oil wealth in the following decades, represented something significantly larger. He was, in other words, a child who grew up knowing he would never need anything. This kind of security can produce almost any kind of adult. But in Osama's case, it produced something specific and recognizable. A man for whom material comfort was never the point, who experienced the enormous financial apparatus of his family not as something to be enjoyed or expanded, but as something to be directed, as a means toward an end that the money itself could never provide. There are glimpses of an ordinary boyhood. He attended the Al-Thajer Model School in Jeddah, a reputable secondary institution. By his own later accounts, and the accounts of people who knew him, he was a football fan, a follower of Arsenal, one of those small biographical details that tends to disorient Western observers, as if fanaticism and English Premier League allegiances cannot coexist in the same person, when in fact they coexist routinely. He was interested in military history. In 1971, when he was 14, he was sent to Oxford to study English for a period, his first sustained exposure to the Western world. But already, running beneath these ordinary-seeming details, another current was moving. Saudi Arabia in the 1960s and 1970s was a society undergoing extraordinary tensions it could not openly acknowledge. The money from oil was arriving so fast and in such quantities that the kingdom's social fabric was being pulled in multiple directions simultaneously. The royal family was modernizing, forming alliances with the United States, allowing American military advisors and businessmen onto sacred soil, tolerating, to a degree, the influence of Western culture and Western economics, and at the same time, the religious establishment, the ulama, the scholars and teachers and clerics who formed the ideological skeleton of Saudi society, were growing more conservative in direct proportion to the pace of change around them. Piety, in this environment, was not merely a private matter. It was a form of protest. When Osama enrolled at King Abdulaziz University in Jeddah in 1976 to study economics and business administration, he encountered this tension directly, and it transformed him. The university was a place where the ideas of Sayyid Qutb were extensively taught and debated. Qutb was an Egyptian scholar, a member of the Muslim Brotherhood who had been arrested and executed by the Nasser government in 1966, and whose prison writings had subsequently spread through the Islamic world with the velocity of something that had been suppressed, and therefore become irresistible. His argument was clear, rigorous, and total. Western civilization was spiritually bankrupt, materially rapacious, and fundamentally hostile to Islam. The Muslim world had been weakened by its accommodation of Western values. The only path to renewal was through jihad, not merely as personal spiritual struggle, as the word was sometimes softened to mean, but as organized, unapologetic holy war in defense of a new Islamic caliphate. Qutb's brother, Mohammed, was on the faculty at Abdulaziz University, while Osama was a student there, continuing the family project of propagating these ideas through higher education. The timing of Osama's intellectual formation coincided almost perfectly with a series of events that seemed, to someone already primed to receive them in a particular way, like confirmation of everything Qutb had argued, In 1978, the Iranian Revolution toppled the Western-backed Shah and installed Ayatollah Khomeini. In the same year, a Marxist party seized power in Afghanistan and began establishing a secular, Soviet-aligned state. In 1979, that Soviet-backed government in Kabul found itself under attack from Islamist insurgents and called on Moscow for help. By December of that year, Soviet tanks were rolling across the Afghan border. Osama bin Laden was 22 years old. He had money, he had connections, he had a theology of confrontation, and now he had a war. He arrived in Pakistan in 1979, almost immediately after finishing his studies at King Abdulaziz University. Whether he completed his degree, the records are incomplete, matters less than the fact of his arrival, the speed of it, the purposefulness. He was not drifting. He had somewhere to go. In Pakistan, he came under the influence of Abdullah Azam, a Palestinian-born jihadist who had spent years building what might be described, without much exaggeration, as the intellectual and organizational infrastructure of modern Islamic terrorism. Azam was a charismatic theologian and recruiter, a man who understood how to translate religious conviction into operational commitment, how to take a young man's desire for meaning and give it a rifle and a cause. He became, for a time, the most important influence on bin Laden's life. Azam encouraged him to join the movement of Muslim volunteers, the Mujahidin, a term meaning roughly those who engage in jihad, in holy war, who were traveling from across the Arab world to fight the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. The destination was the Hindu Kush, the enormous mountain range that dominates the eastern spine of Afghanistan, terrain so unforgiving and so favorable to guerrilla warfare that every foreign army that has attempted to control Afghanistan from the mountain valleys has ultimately failed. The British failed there in the 19th century. The Soviets were about to fail there in the 20th. The Americans would fail there in the 21st. But in 1980, the outcome was not yet clear, and bin Laden threw himself into the effort with the intensity of a man who has found the thing he was looking for without knowing he was looking for it. He began by financing the movement of recruits from Saudi Arabia to Pakistan, drawing on his personal inheritance and on his extensive connections within Saudi society. He paid for equipment, weapons, supplies. He facilitated the construction of infrastructure, roads, tunnels, fortifications, using skills and contacts drawn from the family construction business. He moved between Pakistan and the increasingly bloody terrain of eastern Afghanistan, spending extended periods in the mountains with the fighters. He was not, in these years, primarily a military commander. He was something perhaps more valuable. A wealthy, well-connected Saudi who could translate money into fighting capability, and who was willing to do so while physically present, sharing the conditions of the men he was supplying. In 1984, bin Laden and Azam formalized their operation by establishing Maktab al-Khidmat, often translated as the Services Bureau, an organization designed to raise funds from across the Arab world and, significantly, from Muslim diaspora communities in the West, and to channel those funds into training and equipping anti-Soviet fighters. It had offices in Pakistan and recruiting networks that stretched from Cairo to London to Brooklyn. It is worth being precise here about something that is often blurred in popular accounts. The United States government during this period was spending billions of dollars supporting the Mujahidin through Pakistani intelligence channels. The CIA was deeply involved in the arming and training of anti-Soviet fighters. The Saudi government was spending at least as much. Bin Laden was operating in the same general ecosystem as these efforts, and some contact between his networks and American operatives almost certainly occurred. But the claim, sometimes repeated, that the United States directly trained or created Bin Laden is not supported by the evidence. He was a fellow traveler in a shared cause during the 1980s. He was not an American asset. The distinction matters because the failure to make it has been used in subsequent decades, both to exaggerate and to excuse what Bin Laden became. By 1986, Bin Laden had established a significant operational base in eastern Afghanistan called Al-Masada, the Lion's Den, a complex of training facilities, fortifications, and tunnels in the mountains near the Pakistani border. In the spring and early summer of 1987, the fighters based there played a role in a confrontation with Soviet forces known as the Battle of Jeddah. The battle was not a major turning point in the wider war, which by 1987 was already heading toward Soviet withdrawal, but it generated coverage in the Arab press, including notably from a young Saudi journalist named Jamal Khashoggi, who was traveling with the Mujahidin, and whose reports on the battle spread Bin Laden's name and reputation throughout the Arab world. Khashoggi, who held very different political views than Bin Laden, would later become internationally famous in his own right for reasons of the worst kind. The Soviet-Afghan War was approaching its end by the late 1980s. Mikhail Gorbachev had announced his intention to withdraw as early as 1985. And although an initial attempt to win the war quickly through a troop surge failed, by 1988 peace accords had been signed. And in 1989, the last Soviet soldiers crossed the Oxus River back into Soviet territory. The Marxist regime they had propped up in Kabul collapsed under Mujahidin pressure in 1992. In the wake of this victory, and it was, from the perspective of the Mujahidin and their international supporters, an extraordinary victory, the defeat of a superpower by irregular fighters armed with faith and American-supplied Stinger missiles. A question arose about what to do next. The alliance that had fought the Soviets was diverse, fractious, united mainly by a common enemy that no longer existed. Many of its members wanted to return home. Some wanted to remain a force for moderate Islamic politics. Bin Laden and Azam had a different vision entirely. They wanted to transform the organization into a permanent, global force for Islamic jihadism, one that would extend the logic of the Afghan war to every place where they perceived Islam to be under threat from outside powers. In 1988, before the war had fully ended, they established a new organization. They called it Al-Qaeda, the base, or the foundation. Abdulazam was killed in a car bombing in Peshawar in November 1989. The murder was never definitively solved. Bin Laden was now, unmistakably, the organization's leader. He returned to Saudi Arabia in 1989 to a hero's welcome. He had helped defeat the Soviet Union. He met with members of the royal family, with business leaders, with religious scholars. For a brief period, there was a version of a future available to him in which he became a respected public figure, a wealthy philanthropist of the Islamic cause, a man who had fought a war and could now afford to be comfortable. He was 32 years old. He had a young family. His first wife, Najwa, a Syrian cousin he had married at 17, had already given him several children, and there would eventually be more than 24 children from at least 5 wives. He had money. He had respect. But the world would not stop providing him with things to be furious about. In August 1990, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. The United States began building a military coalition to drive the Iraqis out. And in the autumn of that year, American troops began arriving in Saudi Arabia to use it as the staging ground for an assault. Bin Laden went to King Fahd and made an extraordinary offer. Let me raise an Arab army from my Mujahidin veterans and defend the Saudi border. There will be no need for American soldiers on the soil of the holy places. The offer was declined. The Americans came anyway, and something in Bin Laden, some belief, perhaps the last remaining one, that the system he was operating within could be influenced rather than destroyed. Broke. He began a public campaign of denunciation against the Saudi government. He attempted to persuade senior religious scholars to issue fatwas condemning the American presence. He distributed pamphlets and organized meetings, increasingly open in his contempt for the royal family. In 1991, the Saudi government stripped him of his citizenship and expelled him from the country. He was 34 years old. He had no home. He had, by this point, an organization with global reach, a personal fortune of tens of millions of dollars, combat experience in one of the defining conflicts of the late 20th century, and a worldview that had hardened through a succession of perceived betrayals into something close to absolute. He settled in Sudan in 1992. What the history books usually skip the years between 1992 and 1996, when Bin Laden was based in Khartoum, are often treated in popular accounts as a kind of administrative interlude, a period of organizational consolidation before the attacks that would make him infamous. But something more interesting and more troubling was happening during those years. Bin Laden was constructing a total world, one that was psychologically as much as politically coherent. In Sudan, he was given free rein by Hassan al-Turabi, the Speaker of the Sudanese National Assembly, and the driving intellectual force behind Sudan's own experiment in Islamist governance. Bin Laden lived in a compound in Khartoum, surrounded by followers armed with advanced weapons. He established new training bases near the capital. He operated within the confines of Sudan's acquiescence, more like a sovereign than an exile. He had construction contracts with the Sudanese government, building roads and infrastructure, drawing again on the family trade. He was, by any reasonable account, comfortable. But there is a quality to the comfort of men like Bin Laden that is worth examining. Comfort, for him, was never the end state. It was the condition from which he could generate more commitment, more intensity, more willingness in the men around him to do things that ordinary life would have made unthinkable. The compound in Khartoum was not simply a residence. It was a controlled environment designed to produce a particular kind of person, someone for whom the outside world, its compromises, its accommodations, its moral ambiguity, had ceased to exist. The men who lived and trained there were being reshaped. The world was being simplified down to binary. Islam and its enemies. During these years, Al-Qaeda began carrying out attacks. In 1992, Bin Laden financed the bombing of the Gold Mihr Hotel in Aden, Yemen. A strike aimed at American servicemen using the hotel as a transit point. 2 Yemeni hotel workers were killed instead. In 1993, a former Al-Qaeda trainee named Ramzi Youssef detonated a truck bomb in the parking structure beneath the North Tower of the World Trade Center in Manhattan. The attack was intended to topple one tower into the other. It failed in that ambition, but killed 6 people and injured over 1,000. A pattern was already visible that most intelligence services were not yet reading correctly. Al-Qaeda's attacks in these years were not random. They were symbolic, patient, iterative. They tried something, assessed the result, and returned. The 1993 World Trade Center bombing was not a warning that the towers might one day be attacked. It was the first attempt. There is a psychological portrait of Bin Laden in these years that tends to complicate the image of the cold ideologue. Multiple accounts describe him as personally generous, attentive to the families of his followers, capable of warmth in private settings. He could sit with a fighter for hours, asking about his children, his village, his fears. He was, by the descriptions of those around him, a good listener. He did not project the agitated grandiosity that characterizes many charismatic authoritarian figures. He was quiet. He was still. He spoke slowly and with care. This stillness was, perhaps, the most dangerous thing about him. It made his certainty seem like wisdom rather than pathology. It allowed him to maintain, across decades of increasingly violent decision-making, a self-image as a moral man acting in defense of his people, rather than a man who had decided, at some point in his late 20s or early 30s, that mass civilian death was a legitimate instrument of political change. The evidence suggests he genuinely believed this, not the performed belief of someone rationalizing choices they know to be wrong, but the deep, settled conviction of someone who has arranged the entire architecture of their thinking around a conclusion and can no longer see the arrangement. The deaths of American civilians in New York or Nairobi were not, in his accounting, analogous to the deaths of Muslim civilians in Palestine or Chechnya or Kashmir. The Americans had made a collective political choice to support governments that oppressed Muslim populations. They bore collective responsibility. The logic was not unique to bin Laden. It has been the logic of every movement that has decided its victims deserve what they receive. By 1996, U.S. sanctions against Sudan and the CIA's growing documentation of bin Laden's activities had made his position in Khartoum untenable. Omar al-Bashir, Sudan's president, had outmaneuvered al-Turabi politically, and without al-Turabi's protection, bin Laden was a liability Sudan could no longer afford. He was told, in terms that amounted to expulsion, to leave. He lost significant portions of his personal wealth in the process. Assets frozen, construction contracts dissolved, the financial infrastructure of years dismantled. He went back to Afghanistan, where the Taliban had just consolidated their control over most of the country, and where Mullah Mohammed Omar, their reclusive and theologically rigid leader, offered him sanctuary. The expulsion from Sudan, by most accounts, pushed something in him further and darker. He had now been expelled from his homeland, expelled from his adopted home, stripped of his citizenship, watched much of his fortune dissipate. He had spent nearly 2 decades building something, and the world kept refusing to accommodate it. The result was not defeat. It was escalation. In August 1996, from Afghanistan, he issued a formal declaration of war against the United States. There is a particular quality to bin Laden's thinking in the years after his return to Afghanistan that marks a transition from what might, with considerable charity, have been called ideological commitment to something more specifically apocalyptic. The goal of Al-Qaeda was no longer simply to drive American influence from the Arabian Peninsula, or to punish the United States for its support of Israel, or even to achieve any single concrete political objective. The goal, as it crystallized in the late 1990s, was something larger and stranger: to provoke the United States into a massive military intervention in the Muslim world that would radicalize ordinary Muslims everywhere, trigger a civilizational war, and ultimately produce the conditions for a new Islamic caliphate. The attacks were not ends in themselves. They were meant to be a provocation of enormous proportions, designed to generate a response that would do Al-Qaeda's recruiting for it. It was, by any honest assessment, a theory of change that could only make sense to someone who had decided that an enormous amount of human suffering, including the suffering of the Muslims whose interests he claimed to serve, was an acceptable cost for the outcome he was trying to produce. It was also, in certain of its mechanics, not entirely wrong. The American response to 9/11 would indeed radicalize significant portions of the Muslim world, would drive recruitment for jihadist organizations for years, would produce precisely the kind of prolonged military entanglement in Muslim countries that bin Laden had anticipated. This is worth sitting with. The man was not a fool. He understood American foreign policy and its tendencies well enough to make predictions about how it would respond to a sufficiently spectacular provocation. And some of those predictions were accurate. Whether this constitutes strategic genius or something closer to the cold calculus of someone willing to bet millions of lives on a theory is a question that does not resolve cleanly. The plan that would become the September 11th attacks was first proposed in 1996 by Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, an Al-Qaeda operative of Pakistani-Kuwaiti origin who had spent years developing increasingly ambitious terrorist schemes. Bin Laden approved the general concept in late 1998 or early 1999, and from that point, the operational machinery began to move. The selection of targets was not improvised. The World Trade Center had already been struck once in 1993. It was a symbol chosen with deliberation. The towers represented American financial power, American capitalism, the economic engine that, in bin Laden's analysis, funded the military presence he found intolerable. The Pentagon was the military apparatus itself. The Capitol, the intended target of the fourth plane, was the political center. The attacks were designed not merely to kill people, but to strike at the symbolic nervous system of American power. The 19 men selected to carry them out were screened extensively in Afghanistan. The prerequisite for the operations leaders was that they speak English and be capable of living undetected in Western society for extended periods. Mohammed Atta, a precise and deeply radicalized Egyptian student who had been recruited in Hamburg, became the operational leader. Others were recruited from Germany, from the United Arab Emirates, from Saudi Arabia. They arrived in the United States over the course of 2000, settling in Arizona and Florida and California, taking flying lessons, living ordinary-seeming lives. One of them, Hani Hanger, was selected specifically because he already held a commercial pilot's license. The date was chosen with bin Laden's characteristic attention to symbolism. The 11th of September, in his reading of history, was the anniversary of the day in 1683, when the Polish King John Sobieski III arrived to break the Ottoman siege of Vienna, the moment, in the long narrative of Islamic-Christian confrontation, when the tide had turned against Islam, and the Christian West had begun its centuries of encroachment into Muslim territories. The 11th of September, 2001, was meant to mark the turning of the tide back. What happened that morning is so thoroughly documented, so deeply embedded in the memory of anyone who was alive and conscious on that day, that recounting the sequence of events risks flattening them into the familiar. 4 planes, 2 towers, the Pentagon, a field in Pennsylvania where a plane went down because 40 passengers decided that doing nothing was not an option. 2000, 977 people killed in the space of a few hours, not counting those who would die in the following years from illnesses caused by breathing the air above Lower Manhattan. The most watched act of mass murder in human history, broadcast live on every network simultaneously. The footage of the second plane hitting the South Tower replayed so many times, and for so many years that it became, for an entire generation, the image against which all subsequent disasters would be measured. Bin Laden initially denied involvement. On the 16th of September, 5 days after the attacks, a statement was broadcast claiming he had no knowledge of what had happened. The denial was widely disbelieved, and it was abandoned. In 2004, he appeared on Al Jazeera and acknowledged, in explicit terms, that he had directed the 19 hijackers. He said the attacks had been, in part, symbolic revenge for the destruction of tower buildings in Beirut during the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982. A detail that gave some additional texture to his stated motivation. The towers falling were meant to echo other towers falling in a different city 20 years earlier, with far less media coverage. The American response was swift, overwhelming, and in ways that Bin Laden had anticipated, and in ways he had not, world-altering. Within weeks, the United States had assembled a coalition and begun bombing Afghanistan. A joint congressional resolution passed on the 18th of September, authorizing military force against those responsible for the attacks. Ground operations began on the 19th of October. By early November, American forces had encircled Kabul. The Taliban government, which had refused to surrender Bin Laden to American authorities, collapsed in weeks. Bin Laden was believed to be in the White Mountains, in the Tora Bora cave complex near the Pakistani border. In early December, a coalition force of American Special Forces, CIA operatives, and Northern Alliance fighters conducted a 2-week campaign in those mountains. American intelligence was nearly certain Bin Laden was present. The force was insufficient, a decision whose logic has been extensively debated in the years since, and he escaped, crossing into Pakistan somewhere in the days or weeks following the battle. There is something to dwell on in that escape. The most wanted man in the world, in a landscape of empty rock and snow, crossing a border in winter with presumably a small group of followers, vanishing into the tribal territories of northwestern Pakistan. He was 44 years old. He had spent the last decade living largely outdoors, in compounds and mountain camps, in conditions that had progressively stripped away the material world his birth had promised him. The man who had inherited $30 million was moving through the mountains on foot, sewn into layers of clothing, carrying nothing that could identify him. He would not be found for nearly a decade. The years between 2002 and 2011 are, in the historical record of Bin Laden's life, both the longest and the most opaque. He spent the majority of them in Pakistan, almost certainly in the mountainous Waziristan region for the early years. And then, from 2006 onward, in a purpose-built compound in the city of Abbottabad, a garrison town about 35 miles north of the Pakistani capital, Islamabad, home to the Pakistan Military Academy. The compound had been under construction since shortly after his arrival in the country and was completed in 2005. It occupied 38,000 square feet, surrounded by concrete walls up to 5.5 meters high, topped with barbed wire. There were almost no windows facing the street. The third-floor balcony, where bin Laden spent much of his time in the open air, was screened with a partition tall enough to prevent anyone outside the compound from seeing him. He was hiding in a military city. The compound, with its high walls and absence of utility connections to the national grid, was, to anyone who thought about it for more than a moment, obviously unusual. It is not known whether the Pakistani authorities knew bin Laden was there. Their willingness to accept an official state of not knowing is a study in itself. Meanwhile, Al-Qaeda continued. The organization carried out bombings in Iraq, in Saudi Arabia, in Morocco, in Spain, in the United Kingdom. The attacks on Madrid in March 2004, which killed 191 people, and the attacks on London's transport system in July 2005, which killed 52, were carried out by local cells, inspired by and loosely affiliated with the organization. Bin Laden, in his compound, issued periodic video statements, carefully produced, the backdrop designed to project authority and presence, that were distributed through Al Jazeera and later through online channels. He remained, at least symbolically, the center of something, but the center was eroding. Al-Qaeda was being eclipsed, in the eyes of many would-be jihadists, by more extreme and more operationally effective organizations. Abu Musab al-Zarqawi's group in Iraq, which would eventually become the Islamic State of Iraq, was carrying out the kind of spectacular, relentless violence that attracted recruits in a way that bin Laden's periodic video appearances could not. The Islamic State's brutality toward Muslims who did not conform to its specific interpretation of Islam, including tactics that even Al-Qaeda found excessive, drew a formal split between the two organizations in the years following bin Laden's death. There is an irony here that is difficult to fully look at. By the end of his life, Osama bin Laden, who had spent decades insisting on the uncompromising purity of his cause, was being criticized by people who considered him insufficiently extreme. The Navy SEALs left the Abbottabad compound with bin Laden's body in a single functioning helicopter on the 2nd of May, 2011. A second helicopter, a backup called in after the first had crashed during landing, collected the remaining men. By 8 in the evening, Washington time, on the day of the operation, the body had been positively identified through DNA comparison, with samples held on file from family members. The decision about what to do with the remains had been made in advance. Buried on land, a grave becomes a shrine, a pilgrimage site, a monument that lasts longer than any statement. Bin Laden was therefore taken out to the North Arabian Sea aboard the USS Carl Vinson and buried at sea, wrapped in a white sheet, weighted with chains and rocks, lowered over the side into the dark water. It was done within 24 hours of his death, in compliance with Islamic tradition. There would be no place to go, no marker, no earthly location that could become the center of anything. Whether that worked is a complicated question. The absence of a physical grave did not prevent the mythologizing. In the days following Obama's televised announcement of the raid's success, crowds gathered outside the White House and in Times Square in New York, cheering and waving flags. The footage of those celebrations was itself immediately incorporated into the propaganda of jihadist organizations as evidence of American bloodlust and triumphalism. The death of bin Laden, in other words, was immediately converted into recruitment material. The compound in Abbottabad was subsequently demolished by the Pakistani government. The site is now empty. What American forces found in the compound during their sweep of the premises before leaving was, in its way, as revealing as anything else about the final decade of bin Laden's life. Thousands of files on USB drives and hard drives and printed papers. Correspondence with Al-Qaeda affiliates around the world. Documents showing that bin Laden had been far more operationally involved in planning ongoing terrorist activities than some analysts had suggested. Not simply a symbolic figurehead, but an active participant in the direction of attacks, offering strategic and tactical guidance, weighing in on targets, personnel, timing. He had been paying attention from inside his compound in ways that the outside world had underestimated. He had also been watching a large quantity of video of himself. This detail is often noted with something between amusement and contempt, but it is worth considering what it might mean. A man confined to a compound for years, unable to move freely in the world, watching his own archive, watching the speeches, the interviews, the statements, the footage of his younger self in the mountains of Afghanistan, with fighters around him, and purpose radiating from every frame. The quality of that attention, whether it was vanity or loneliness, or something more like a man trying to remember what he had been fighting for, is impossible to know. The legacy of Osama bin Laden is difficult to assess with any stability because it depends entirely on the timeline you are using and the perspective from which you are looking. By the most immediate measure, he failed. His stated strategic goal, to drive American military forces from the Arabian Peninsula and ultimately from the Muslim world, was not achieved. American troops remained in Saudi Arabia for years after 9/11 and are there still in various configurations. The invasion of Afghanistan that his attacks provoked resulted in 20 years of occupation and the deaths of tens of thousands of Afghans. The Iraq War, which his attacks helped enable by providing the emotional and political atmosphere in which the Bush administration's ambitions found popular support, killed hundreds of thousands of Iraqi civilians and destabilized a region that remains unstable today. By a different measure of longer duration, the picture changes. The United States did eventually withdraw from Afghanistan in 2021 in circumstances of evident failure, and the Taliban government he had sheltered under returned to power. American public appetite for large-scale military intervention in the Muslim world was, after 2 decades of inconclusive wars, essentially exhausted. The unipolar moment of American dominance that had characterized the 1990s was over. Whether bin Laden caused any of this, or simply surfed a historical current that was moving anyway, is the kind of question that historians will not resolve cleanly. What is certain is that the specific damage he caused, the nearly 3,000 dead on September 11th alone, the thousands more killed in the wars and attacks that followed, the decades of fear and security theater, the erosion of civil liberties in the name of counterterrorism, the transformation of air travel and public space and international relations, was real, lasting, and still reverberating. Al-Qaeda itself survived bin Laden's death, led by Ayman al-Zawahiri, and continued organizing attacks for years. Zawahiri was himself killed in a U.S. drone strike in Kabul in July 2022, 11 years after bin Laden. The organization still exists, diminished but not eliminated, operating primarily in Yemen, Somalia, and the Sahel. The Islamic State, which grew from Al-Qaeda's Iraqi franchise and surpassed it in brutality and territorial ambition, declared its caliphate in 2014. The exact political structure bin Laden had claimed to be working toward. He did not live to see it. He would likely have had complicated feelings about it, given the degree to which the Islamic State's methods appalled even Al-Qaeda's leadership. The caliphate was dismantled by 2017, its territory recaptured, its leadership scattered or killed. The world that existed on the morning of September 11th, 2001, is not recoverable. This is the most honest summary of bin Laden's legacy. Not that he won, and not simply that he lost, but that he broke something that could not be unbroken, and that the pieces have never quite reassembled into the shape they had before. There's a question that sits underneath all the history, one that the history itself cannot quite answer. What would have happened to Osama bin Laden in a different world? This is not a question about whether terrorism can be excused, or whether the grievances he cited were legitimate, or whether anything about his methods was justified. None of those questions are particularly interesting at this point. The question is more personal, and perhaps more unsettling. What was the actual mechanism of his becoming? He was born into extraordinary wealth in a society undergoing profound and destabilizing change. He was raised in a tradition that placed enormous weight on religious purity and collective identity. He was educated in ideas that offered a total explanation of the world's suffering and a total prescription for its remedy. He experienced the defeat of a superpower by guerrilla fighters he had supported, and came away from that experience with the lesson that will lead to victory. That conviction, properly organized and financed, can overcome almost anything. He was expelled from his home country, deprived of citizenship, watched his wealth diminish, moved from country to country at the pleasure of governments that had their own calculations to make. He spent the last decade of his life in a compound 38,000 square feet large, with walls 5 meters high. Watching videos of himself, he was, in other words, a product. Not in the sense that lets anyone off the hook. He made choices, consequential ones, that killed thousands of people and altered the trajectory of the early 21st century. But he was a product of specific forces that have not gone away. The vertigo of rapid modernization in traditional societies, the appeal of ideologies that offer clarity to people living in confusion, the way that wealth and religious conviction, under the right pressure, can generate not compassion, but its opposite. Somewhere under the North Arabian Sea, the chains have held for 14 years now. The question of what a person is, stripped of their actions and their ideology and their famous face. The question of what was actually there, in that bedroom in Abbottabad, in the doorway, in the last moment before the Navy SEAL fired, is the kind of question that history is not equipped to answer. History can tell you what he did. It has a harder time telling you what he was. The water is deep out there, very cold and very still. And whatever was Osama bin Laden lies at the bottom of it now, in the dark, with no marker, dissolving slowly into the sea.